Preface. The expression contemporary history is probably self-contradictory. Now this is a actual text written by the esteemed Professor Carrol Quigley. Preface. The expression contemporary history is probably self-contradictory, because what is contemporary is not history, and what is history is not contemporary. Sensible historians usually refrain from writing accounts of very recent events, because they realize that the source materials for such events, especially the indispensable official documents, are not available, and that even with the documentation which is available, it is very difficult for anyone to obtain the necessary perspective on the events of one's own mature life. But I must clearly not be a sensible, or at least an ordinary historian, for having covered in an earlier book the whole of human history in a mere 271 pages, I now use more than 1,300 pages for the events of a single lifetime. There's a connection here. It will be evident to any attentive reader that I have devoted long years of study and much original research, even where adequate documentation is not available. But it should be equally evident that whatever value this present work has rests on its broad perspective. I have tried to remedy deficiencies of evidence by perspective, not only by projecting the patterns of past history into the present and the future, but also by trying to place the events of the present in their total context, by examining all the varied aspects of these events. Not merely the political and economic, as is so frequently done, but by my efforts to bring into the picture the military, technological, social, and intellectual elements as well. The result of all this, I hope, is an interpretation of the present as well as the immediate past and the near future, which is free from the accepted clichés, slogans, and self-justifications which mar so much of contemporary history. Much of my adult life has been devoted to training undergraduates in techniques of historical analysis, which will help them to free their understanding of history from the accepted categories and cognitive classifications of the society in which we live, since these, however necessary they may be for our processes of thought and for the concepts and symbols needed for us to communicate about reality, nevertheless do often serve as barriers which shield us from recognition of the underlying realities themselves. The present work is the result of such an attempt to look at the real situations which lie beneath the conceptual and verbal symbols. I feel that it does provide, as a consequence of this effort, a fresher, somewhat different, and I hope more satisfying explanation of how we arrived at the situation in which we now found ourselves. More than 20 years have gone into the writing of this work. Although most of it is based on the usual accounts of these events, some portions are based on fairly intensive personal research, including research among manuscript materials. These portions include the following: the nature and techniques of financial capitalism, the economic structure of France under the Third Republic, the social history of the United States, and the membership and activities of the English establishment. On other subjects, my reading has been as wide as I could make it, and I have tried consistently to view all subjects from as wide and as varied points of view as I am capable. Although I regard myself, for purposes of classification, as a historian, I did a great deal of study in political science at Harvard, have persisted in the private study of modern psychological theory for more than 30 years, and have been a member of the American Anthropological Association, the American Economic Association, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, as well as the American Historical Association for many years. Thus my chief justification for writing a lengthy work on contemporary history, despite the necessarily restricted nature of the documentation, must be based on my efforts to remedy this inevitable deficiency by using historical perspective to permit me to project the tendencies of the past into the present and even the future, and my efforts to give this attempt a more solid basis by using all the evidence from a wide variety of academic disciplines. As a consequence of these efforts to use this broad and perhaps complex method, this book is almost inexcusably lengthy. For this I must apologize, with the excuse that I did not have time to make it shorter, and that an admittedly tentative and interpretative work must necessarily be longer than a more definite or more dogmatic presentation. To those who find the length excessive, I can only say that I omitted chapters which were already written on three topics: the agricultural history of Europe, the domestic history of France and Italy, and the intellectual history of the 20th century in general. To do this, I introduced enough on these subjects into other chapters. Although I project the interpretation into the near future on a number of occasions, the historical narrative ceases in 1964, not because the date of writing caught up with the march of historical events, but because the period 1962 to 1964 seems to me to mark the end of an era of historical development and a period of pause before a quite different era with quite different problems begins. This change is evident in a number of obvious events, such as the fact that the leaders of all the major countries, except really China and France, and of many lesser ones, such as Canada, India, West Germany, the Vatican, Brazil, and Israel, were changed in this period. Much more important is the fact that the Cold War, which culminated in the Cuban crisis of October 1962, began to dwindle toward its end during the next 2 years, a process which was evident in a number of events, such as the rapid replacement of the Cold War by competitive coexistence, the disintegration of the two superblocks which had faced each other during the Cold War, the rise of neutralism both within the superblocks and in the buffer fringe of third bloc powers between them, the swamping of the United Nations General Assembly under a flood of newly independent, sometimes microscopic pseudo-powers, the growing parallelism of the Soviet Union and the United States, and the growing emphasis in all parts of the world on problems of living standards, of social maladjustments, and of mental health, replacing the previous emphasis on armaments, nuclear tensions, and heavy industrialization. At such a period, when one era seems to be ending, and a different, if yet indistinct era appearing, it seemed to me as good a time as any to evaluate the past and to seek some explanation of how we arrived where we are. In any preface such as this, it is customary to conclude with acknowledgment of personal obligations. My sense of these is so broad that I find it invidious to single out some and to omit others. But four must be mentioned. Much of this book was typed, in her usual faultless way, by my wife. This was done originally, and in revised versions, in spite of the constant distractions of her domestic obligations, of her own professional career in a different university, and of her own writing and publication. For her cheerful assumption of this great burden, I am very grateful. Similarly, I am grateful to the patience, enthusiasm, and amazingly wide knowledge of my editor at the Macmillan Company, Peter V. Rittner. I wish to express my gratitude to the University Grants Committee of Georgetown University, which twice provided funds for summer research. And finally, I must say a word of thanks to my students over many years, who forced me to keep up with the rapidly changing customs and outlook of our young people, and sometimes also compelled me to recognize that my way of looking at the world is not necessarily the only way, or even the best way, to look at it. Many of these students, past, present, and future, are included in the dedication of this book. Carrol Quigley, Washington, D.C., March 8, 1965.